Hi everyone. As Shireen said, I work for the Vegan Society. We're the oldest vegan organisation in the world. Our founders coined the term veganism in 1944, and we're an educational charity that work to help people to go vegan and stay vegan. So obviously the nutrition side of things is my area of expertise. So today's session will probably be no longer than half an hour. I'll try to make sure that it isn't death by PowerPoint, although I've prepared a few slides for you. There'll be some time for questions at the end, so if you've got any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. But if you prefer to drop me an email, you are welcome to email nutrition@vegansociety.com. And if you're interested in tweets related to vegan nutrition and similar issues, you can follow me on Twitter at Herbie with an I, Heather. So hopefully by the end of this session, you'll be able to address a few common myths around vegan nutrition and get a really good idea of how to actually get the most out of a diet that doesn't contain animal products, so a totally plant-based diet. I'm just going to kick off with one of the popular myths about plant-based nutrition. So if I had £1 for every time someone asked me about protein, I'd probably be a very rich dietitian by now. So people often worry that it's tricky to get the protein that you need from your diet, and the sort of protein hype in the UK is quite interesting really when you think about the levels of protein in most people's diets. So it doesn't tend to be a nutrient that's problematic for most people, with a few exceptions. But certainly when we're thinking about totally plant-based nutrition, we can get all the building blocks, the protein building blocks that we need without animal products. So another name for these building blocks is amino acids. So there are a few sort of basic principles that will help most people to get the protein that they need. So it's important overall to make sure that you're getting enough energy, because if your body's not getting enough energy, it's going to have to look for that from other sources, and sometimes you can actually end up using even protein from your muscles, for example, to sort of generate enough energy, particularly if you're losing weight rapidly, for example. In terms of looking at the overall quality of your diet, it's really important to have a varied diet, so getting protein from lots of different sources. People used to think that you needed to have a meal that contained the sort of perfect combination of amino acids at one time, but now we understand a bit more about protein. We realise that really it's about just getting a good balance across the day, eating protein-rich foods and getting a good variety of foods. But there are certain foods that are better sources of protein than others. They tend to be ones that contain good amounts of an amino acid called lysine. So these are foods like legumes, so they're real superstars in the world of vegan nutrition. So we're talking about beans, peas and lentils. They're really health promoting foods, and it really is a good idea to try and eat those a couple of times a day if you really want to get the most out of a vegan diet. Also soya products, we'll look at soya a little bit later, but it is a high quality source of protein. The quality is similar to meat and dairy, so if you're looking for one of the best sources of protein, it can be a really good option. Certain nuts like cashew nuts, for example, are good sources of protein. Certain seeds like pumpkin seeds, for example, provide some good quality protein as well. And even something like peanut butter would provide some reasonable quality protein too. So just about trying to get those types of foods into most of your meals, and for most of us that will provide a good amount of protein across the day. So I get quite a lot of emails, etc., from people who are worried about dropping oily fish from their diet, because obviously in general healthy eating guidelines do include oily fish. So it's really important to think about including a source of omega-3 fat in your diet, whether or not you're eating oily fish. And certainly if you choose not to, there are other ways to do it. So one of the basic principles is to make sure that you're getting short chain omega-3 fat into your daily diet. So the other name for that's alpha linoleic acid, or ALA. So some of the best sources of things as simple as having like a handful of walnuts every day, or maybe a tablespoon of ground linseed or flaxseed as it's also called, and chia seeds and hemp seeds are also really rich sources of this type of fat. So that's sort of a basic recommendation to work into your daily diet. It is possible to get the long chain omega-3 fats like EPA and DHA from a non-oily fish source. So you can use a microalgae supplement. It's not thought to be essential for vegan health. Certainly we need more research in that area. There's some evidence that taking that type of supplement increases the level of omega-3 fat in your blood, but we're not really sure about the sort of health benefits that might translate to. If you're pregnant or breastfeeding or during childhood, it might be a more important consideration because of the role of these type of fats in brain development and the development of nerves and your eyes as well. But certainly for most of us, it's just something to consider, but not sort of something that you should consider as an essential element of a vegan diet. Iron crops up quite a lot. So iron deficiency is a really common nutritional deficiency across the world. Doesn't matter what country you're in the world, it's a really big problem for people in general. We don't think there's a particular difference between people who eat diets containing meat and people who eat meat-free diets, but certainly it is important to make sure that you're eating good quantities of iron-rich foods every day. And the good news is there's loads of plant foods that contain good amounts. So a lot of the plant foods that provide iron also tend to provide good amounts of protein as well. So if you're making sure you've got good sources of protein in your diet, you're probably getting good amounts of iron as well, and also zinc. So things like the legumes that we mentioned earlier, your beans, peas and lentils. Pumpkin seed, for example, could provide a good amount of iron too, but also lower protein foods that are iron rich. So even something as simple as raisins or kale could also provide a good amount of iron as well. The other trick, if you're eating plant-based sources of iron, is to make sure that all of your meals contain a good source of vitamin C. So you might immediately think of citrus fruits like oranges, but there's loads of sweet and savoury sources of vitamin C. So for example, it could be something as simple as putting broccoli in a tofu stir fry, and then you've got an iron-rich food with a good source of vitamin C to help with iron absorption. So if you're looking to optimise your iron status, then those are sort of two really helpful habits, and you can get plenty of iron from a diet that's totally plant-based. A lot of people worry that you can't get enough calcium without dairy. If you switch to a fortified alternative, for example, fortified soya milk, it doesn't really impact at all on your calcium intake because they deliberately put a similar amount of calcium in fortified plant milk, so that you're getting a similar amount of calcium from a glass of cow's milk and a glass of fortified plant milk. So that's a really easy way of maintaining your calcium intake. And the UK's Eat Well guide, which is sort of the plate-like thing that you might have seen, recognises the role of these fortified dairy alternatives in providing calcium. So, it's something that can be really, really useful, and we'll have a little look at calcium in a bit more detail later as well. Also, obviously, you've got yogurt alternatives that are fortified with calcium too, so those can present some good options for replacing calcium. So this sort of follows on from that slide. Some people believe that certain greens contain a lot of calcium. Now, certainly some greens contain reasonable amounts of well-absorbed calcium, but we're still talking about way less calcium per serving than a glass of fortified plant milk. So if you are relying on greens to get your calcium, it's worth being aware that you really do have to eat quite a vast quantity of them. So I just crunched a few numbers using the UK's food composition data, just some examples of greens that have well-absorbed calcium in them. So that list, which is obviously quite a hefty amount of greens, would actually only make up about half of the amount of calcium you'd be aiming for in a day, which is 700 milligrams. Whereas if you had 2 glasses of fortified plant milk, that would provide about 2/3 of that target. So you can understand why when you're replacing dairy, ideally you want calcium-rich foods that have got A, well-absorbed calcium, and B, also a really good amount of calcium per serving. Otherwise, you're going to be having to eat very large quantities of these foods. So that's one of the reasons why I'd really recommend replacing dairy with some sort of fortified product or something like calcium set tofu, which also has a really useful amount of calcium in it. There's also a certain type of bread as well on the market that has extra calcium added to it, which is quite useful, especially if you're not keen on the sort of things that do taste and look like milk and yogurt, so that's quite handy. Vitamin B12 obviously crops up a lot when we talk about plant-based nutrition. So basically, this particular nutrient comes from microorganisms. So it's not a nutrient that's produced by plants. So anyone who either chooses not to eat animal products or doesn't eat them regularly won't be getting regular sources of vitamin B12 unless they take the recommended approaches, which are either using a certain amount of fortified foods, so that could be something like nutritional yeast flakes and fortified plant milk, for example, or using a supplement. And obviously, depends on the type of supplement that you're taking. You might use one daily or weekly. We've got recommendations about doses for all of those approaches on our website at vegansociety.com/nutrition, and lots of more useful information on there, so do check it out. This is quite an interesting topic, so I think it's always worth sort of mentioning when you're talking about nutrition that everyone needs to think about balancing food groups well, and fortified foods play a role in all of our diets, and supplements also play a role for many people. So in the UK, vitamin D supplementation is recommended for everyone during autumn and winter as a minimum, and as a dietitian I love to bang on about it because I meet loads of people who have no idea that's a recommendation for our country as a whole. So please do spread the message far and wide. It is worth being aware that a lot of supplements contain vitamin D3 from animal fat. So if you want a vegan-friendly supplement, obviously you need to make sure that you're buying the right type of product. Generally, vitamin D2 is an animal-free source, and you can get vitamin D3 from lichen, which is found in the Vegan Society's Veg1 supplement. So there are a couple of options. It's also worth being aware there are some general supplement recommendations for under 5s in the UK, whether they're vegan or not. So obviously there's a vitamin D recommendation, apart from babies who are having more than 500 ml of infant formula daily. And also supplementation of vitamins A and C is recommended in general as a sort of nutritional safety net. So it's worth being aware that those recommendations exist. In terms of other supplements, it's recommended that if you're of childbearing age, that you use a folic acid supplement, so it really helps to reduce the risk of neural tube defects, and that's also recommended during the first trimester of pregnancy as well. So it is an important part of pregnancy planning. So, and that's another supplement recommendation to be aware of. So supplementation definitely can play an important role in vegan nutrition, but it's not just a vegan thing. Soya, there's a lot of concern about soya, so I thought I'd just touch on it during this presentation. So a balanced diet containing soya is safe for reproductive health. The phytoestrogens that are found in soya aren't exactly the same as the sex hormone estrogen, so they don't have exactly the same effects on our bodies. As I mentioned earlier, it is a really high quality source of protein. So if you've got people with higher protein needs who might need lots of really high quality protein in a small package, then it can be a particularly valuable source of nutrition. So for example, under 5s or people who are really athletic with higher protein requirements, or older adults as well who actually need a higher amount of protein per kilogram of body weight during the day compared to people who are younger. So once you hit sort of 65, it's recommended that you actually get a bit more protein in your diet, in combination with a variety of activities that help to promote endurance and strength and balance and coordination. So that's something that's worth being aware of as you get older as well. So you'd be really looking to have sources of protein in all of your meals at that age. If you ever want to share some useful information about soya, the British Dietetic Association, which is my professional body, have a really good fact sheet on soya, which you can find using this link. So I'd really recommend taking a look at that if you want to share information or if you need a bit of reassurance about soya. Nutrition and veganism and children is probably one of the most emotive combinations I can think of. The media love to run stories about it. And we're really proud to work with the British Dietetic Association, sharing the message that well-planned vegan diets can support healthy living in people of all ages. There are still a lot of people out there who believe that, potentially it's dangerous to be offering vegan nutrition to children, but it's possible to provide all of the nutrients that are required for growth and development without animal products. So that's obviously something that we share as an organisation supported by the British Dietetic Association. And the American Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, they have a similar statement about both vegetarian and vegan diets, so it's worth being aware of that one as well. My last myth is that athletes can't thrive on vegan diets. So I think perhaps, vegan athletes are the best living proof that this isn't the case, but in a nutshell, vegan nutrition can support elite performance. And certainly you can hit higher protein targets without using protein supplements, just by eating lots of good sources of plant protein. Soya milk can be particularly useful for people who are athletic because the protein content is much higher than other types of plant milk, so those soya dairy alternatives can be really handy if you're trying to hit higher protein targets. And some athletes do struggle a little bit with the volume of food that they need to eat, whether they're vegan or not. So if you need a less bulky diet that's still going to pack a punch in terms of overall fuel and protein, then certain things like soya and vegan corn are handy because they both got high quality protein in them. Nut and seed butters can be quite energy dense as well as providing protein. And also it's sometimes useful to include some things like white pasta and rice, because if you've got a bit of a limited appetite, then sometimes having whole grains on top all the time can actually make it a little bit more challenging to hit your targets. So those tips are useful for some people. That kind of concludes the sort of myth-busting part of the session. But I just wanted to run through in the second half kind of some general guidelines about eating a balanced vegan diet. So I don't yet have a vegan version of the Eat Well guide produced by the Vegan Society, but I do have a boring table that I can talk through with you now. So I tried to make it a bit more interesting than just words on a page. So obviously with fruit, most of us have probably come across the NHS's 5 a day message at some point. Certainly if you're hitting 5 a day, don't just stop there. There might be benefits to eating up to 10 portions of fruit and vegetables daily. There are certain types of fruit and vegetables that might be important to sort of make more of an effort to incorporate into your daily diet. So leafy greens, for example, are good sources of vitamin K for vegans. Also, there are a lot of green and orange foods that are good sources of carotenoids that our bodies convert into vitamin A. So this might be something as simple as the humble carrot, or some sweet potato, or some butternut squash, or some spinach. As I mentioned earlier, it's a good idea to have good sources of vitamin C in your meals as well to help with iron absorption. So those are a few thoughts around fruit and vegetables. Starchy carbohydrates, it's a pretty similar deal whether you're vegan or not, so it's a good idea to include these foods in your meals. They're a source of energy, and it's been shown in a lot of research that whole grains are beneficial, so trying to go for those whole wheat, whole meal options is thought to be a really health promoting habit, and also helps us towards our fibre target, which is arguably a lot easier to hit if your diet is totally plant-based. As we've said, in terms of protein-rich foods, it's about including good sources in most of your meals. So that might be things like your legumes, soya products, even something as simple as peanut butter. In terms of calcium-rich foods, as I said earlier, I'd really recommend trying to get in at least a couple of portions of fortified foods, whether that's a fortified plant milk, fortified plant-based alternative to yogurt, soya and linseed bread with extra calcium in it, or calcium set tofu is another food that's got a really good amount of calcium per serving. So just as an example, you might aim to get at least 400 ml of fortified plant milk in your daily diet, which would help you well on the way to your calcium target for the day. And it's also important, obviously, to get that omega-3 fat source into your daily diet. So something like a handful of walnuts or a tablespoon of ground linseed would do the trick. Question, do I need supplements? Well, hopefully by now, if you've been listening, you know that the answer is yes, but that's not just for vegans, it's for everyone in the UK in relation to vitamin D recommendations. But there are a few nutrients that deserve special attention when you're talking about vegan nutrition. So obviously it's important to get that source of vitamin B12 into a totally plant-based diet. There's also a couple of minerals to think about. So iodine is one that I think doesn't necessarily get as much attention as it deserves. Fortunately, there are more and more plant milks being released onto the market that now have added iodine. Iodine tends to be found in small amounts in plant foods. The soil in the UK doesn't tend to be particularly rich in iodine, and we don't iodise our salt. So according to the World Health Organization, we're a country at higher risk of iodine deficiency. The main sources of iodine in British diets are dairy and fish. So obviously if you're vegan, you choose not to eat those items. So you do need to make sure that you're getting a reliable source of iodine from somewhere else. So it could be that you make good use of fortified plant milk with added iodine, or it might be that you choose to use a supplement. Some people use seaweed. It is worth being aware that seaweed is a very varied group of foods in terms of iodine content. It's very easy, almost impossible not to overdose on iodine by eating kelp, whereas something like nori, which is the sort of seaweed sheets used to make sushi, is a much lower iodine content food. And based on the data that we've looked at, if you are keen to use something like seaweed instead of a fortified food or a supplement, probably nori is the best one to go for, and we have some recommendations on our website about that. Selenium's kind of similar, so you tend to find fairly small amounts of selenium in most plant foods. Brazil nuts are a bit of an exception because they tend to grow in selenium-rich soil, so even sort of 1 or 2 selenium Brazil nuts daily can be a really good top-up, selenium top-up for your daily diet. Or you can use a supplement that contains selenium. And obviously, as I said, omega-3 fat supplements aren't essential, just something that you might consider more seriously during pregnancy, breastfeeding, or childhood. So in terms of getting the most out of your vegan diet, definitely a good idea to eat a really wide variety of fruit and vegetables, at least 5 a day, and aiming higher if you can. Choosing those whole grain and higher fibre starchy carbohydrates. Trying to make sure that at least most of your meals have good sources of protein in them, like your beans, peas and lentils, which are also going to provide good amounts of iron and zinc too. Making sure that you have a good source of omega-3 fat in your daily diet, something as simple as a handful of walnuts. Eating those calcium-rich foods daily, so it might be, for example, at least a couple of glasses of fortified plant milk. Making sure that you have your vitamin D supplement during autumn and winter as a minimum, and also making sure that you get a reliable source of vitamin B12, iodine and selenium into your diet as well. We did put together a free app called VNutrition, which is sort of based on the principles of the UK's Eat Well guide, with a few extra considerations for vegans. So this is like a dietary self-assessment tool. So it's designed to help you to look at your own daily diet, compare it to healthy eating guidelines, and sort of figure out whether you're kind of hitting the targets that you want to be hitting, or whether you need to make some tweaks to your diet. So if you are wanting to review your diet, it could be a really useful tool. And we have a bit of information about it on our website in our blog section. That's the end of the slides. Thank you.